This week, first up, a topic discussion on how we can do better when it comes to prioritizing patches and remediation efforts with Mr. Josh Bressers. Then in the security news, yet another vulnerable driver. Why bring your own when one already exists? Backdoors in MyFair Classic, wireless hacking tips, AMD Synclose vulnerability will keep you running. You down with SLDP? Yeah, you know me. Frack is back. IoT goats, pixel vulnerabilities, leaking variables, a DEF CON talk that was not canceled in the end. Telnet is still a thing. More CNAs. Give me an SBAT, or better yet, please don't. And the last thing Flint, Michigan needed was a ransomware attack. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Quick question. Do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1Password. BreachLock is a global leader in continuous attack surface discovery and penetration testing. Since BreachLock was founded, they are adding over 50 new customers every month. They have discovered over 1 million reported vulnerabilities and performed more than 20,000 pen testing engagements, including pen tests for over 15,000 web applications, 8,000 mobile apps, more than 100,000 APIs, over 10,000 cloud security audits, and over 200,000 network endpoints. They test your entire attack surface and help you mitigate your next cyber breach before it occurs. Know your risk. Contact BreachLock today. Visit securityweekly.com/BreachLock. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 840, being recorded on Wednesday, August 21st, 2024. I'm Paul Asadorian. Mr. Bill Swearingen is with us. Bill, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Glad to be here.
Good to have you. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome. Hi, Jeff. Bye, Jeff. Hi, Jeff. Jeff's on mute. Mandy Logan's here with us. Can we hear Mandy? We can't hear. Mandy can't hear me. Oh, you can talk. Mandy, are you talking or not? We'll have ghosts in this episode. Like every once in a while, a co-host will just chime in and we'll have no idea where it came from.
Listen, I like it. That means more airtime for me.
Right?
So, yeah.
Mr. Josh Bressers is here with us. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I hope my audio works.
Yes, it does. I can hear you.
Fantastic.
We'll work on. I'm going to do announcements, and I got one announcement. So I'll be at GurCon along with Jeff, who is speaking at the conference. If he's speaking now, we can't hear him.
Even though I'm not speaking, okay. Can you hear me now?
Oh, you're not speaking at GurCon.
I am speaking at GurCon. I'm not speaking now because I unmuted and so did an engineer.
Gotcha. Okay,
it was a double whammy.
Well, we can hear Jeff now, and you get to hear him on September 26th and the 27th, or in one of those days anyway, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, because who doesn't want to go to Grand Rapids, Michigan? I'm excited. Make sure you stop by the Eclipsium booth to say hello. Hopefully we'll have some cool stuff to check out. I am encouraging folks to bring your M5 stack hacking devices. Bring it by the booth. I'll be hanging out there, and we can hack. I would love nothing more than to hack stuff together with folks in the community. So that's my plan. Tentatively, hopefully you'll hear about more details coming out. Okay. Is Mandy Logan here with us? No, she's still a ghost. Still a ghost. That's okay. We'll get that sorted out. Wait. Mostly in spirit. Mandy?
Hello.
Oh, yeah, she's here. Yay.
Nice.
All right. We can hear everyone. Everyone can hear us. We have ourselves a podcast, folks. And today, in this segment of the podcast, we're talking about what should we patch? Every week here on the show, we talk about vulnerabilities and exploits. Usually there's at least a few that we cover. And we recommend that organizations remediate those vulnerabilities in some way. but how, and more importantly, which ones. And I've got a list of tools that we can talk about, maybe interweave into the conversation. So I've got Mitre Att&ck, CVSS, the CVSS, and EPSS. Aside from CVSS,
Not to mention PCI. Come on,
and
man.
I mean, what would be an acronym alphabet soup without PCI? Aside from CVSS, though, I've interviewed the people who are spearheading and leading the teams at various organizations for EPSS, Mitre Att&ck, and CVSS. So I've gained a lot of insights from those very smart people, and I have opinions. But I want to turn it over to my illustrious co-hosts and get your thoughts on, given the frameworks and tools, like what's your opinion on these frameworks and tools that I mentioned? Or maybe you have an additional framework or tool you want to mention that helps us figure out what we should patch first.
I'll start.
Okay, Jeff.
I hit the buzzer first. PCI has been requiring since 2010 for companies to do risk ranking. There was a phase of marketing buzzwords going around right around the time of COVID, vulnerability prioritization. That kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. But I guess my contention, or my question for this esteemed group is there more to it than just applying a CVSS score and a better formula? Is there more to think about than just accepting the ranking however it comes to you from whatever tool, or even from the vendor themselves, in theory, saying this is a bad vulnerability? I think PCI allows and requires organizations to take into organizational factors, like where on the network, how far away from the internet is it, the likelihood of success, what I think about, like collision hashing, hashing collisions, that takes a lot of work. Is somebody going to really try to do that on some internal system to get one little piece of information? What are the environmental factors or variables that I think that should be part of the discussion?
Well, yeah, and you can do that with CVSS. They have a calculator that allows you to take into account those environmental things. The problem with that is you'd have to use that for every vulnerability that you're evaluating.
I've never seen anyone use that ever.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that came with version 3, didn't it, Paul?
I believe so.
And we're now up to version 4. Well, I guess I should add, PCI doesn't want you doing things on the fly with every vulnerability. They want you to have sort of, pre-existing conditions, as it were, that you can more quickly rule things out and not remediate as quickly, or help you prioritize, if that's a word we're going to use.
Yeah, and I feel that leads to the adoption of people just going by the CVSS score, which you should not. I mean, just like in this segment, and I've got a blog post coming out on this topic, which is what led us to have this discussion. But I think that if you're just relying on the CVSS score, you're doing yourselves a disservice, right? Because that is a score for the vulnerability. That score was created by someone else. It very likely could have been NVD. It very likely could have been the CNA, CV Numbering Authority, that assigned that score. Sometimes you get both that score that. Other times, independent folks, I mean, I don't believe it gets published into the CVE record, but like I've seen in the past where the security researchers that found the vulnerability are also applying a CVSS score. And it's basically a formula where a human being has to plug in various values, right? And every human being has a different opinion of what some of those scores or values should be that go into making up the score. So I think that's one reason why you're doing yourselves a disservice. Josh, I can see you're
I so much to add. So I'm going to add one more layer of complexity to this. Is CISA has started a project called Vulnrichment, where they're enriching CVE information, but only when the CNA hasn't added the enrichment. And so now you could have a situation where the CNA could add a CVSS score, CISA could add a CVSS score, NVD could add a CVSS score. And in theory, the Vulnrichment project would remove their score if the CNA adds one. So there shouldn't be overlap there, but NVD will still do their own thing. And it gets even weirder because NVD, for example, takes the worst case scenario position on CVSS scoring, which is why you see all these 10s, because they're assuming you have something wide open to the internet with no authentication behind it, which of course, well, that probably is true in
You
some
could
cases.
have
But
that. I mean, that's the other problem with CVSS is the situation is going to vary, right? To say this vulnerability has a certain severity,
Yeah.
well, it could be on a system where I have tons of compensating controls, and man, there are people looking at that system 6 ways to Sunday, and it's the most critical asset. But if that vulnerability pops up on a different system, maybe in a different organization that has other contributing factors, that 4 could likely be a 10 in your environment, like because it's everything
yeah.
is
Yep.
is intertwined, and that's why I'm not big on basing everything just on CVSS. Bill.
So I wonder, Paul, like, so, we kind of jumped right into it without even asking the question, do we even need to prioritize
Yep.
anything? Like, why,
Well,
why do,
I was gonna say the same thing. Just do you patch or not is the first question before you
right.
even consider the criticality. I think.
Yeah, and so I'm curious how everybody feels about that. Why do we need to prioritize anything? Like, shouldn't the way that patching works and just all of that, shouldn't that be a machine that's running right now in every environment? And I'm saying that tongue in cheek, of course, because I've
Right.
also lived in the real world myself. But like, I'm curious how everybody feels about
Well,
that.
that's the argument you often get is, well, we can't possibly patch everything all the time. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, right? I think we're calling that out basically is what we're doing now. And the point of this discussion is we're going, well, but what if you tried to figure out a way where you could patch everything?
Hmm.
And my answer to that is, okay, if you can't patch everything, patch what's important on the most critical systems that are most critical to the business. But even that you could poke holes in and say, well, and as pen testers, right? I mean, I lived a life as a pen tester for a while, and I would find what was seemingly the most unimportant system that wasn't being paid attention to, and I would gain a foothold there, and then would go, well,
Yeah.
how can I escalate privileges here? How can I move laterally there? What else can I find that lets me get to like the next level in the video game, right? That lets me
Yeah.
continue to
So,
escalate.
so most of my experience doing IR, and I've done IR in cases, very, very large cases. They generally, like, almost 90% of the time, it's one of those boxes that says, "Oh, we were going to decommission
Yep.
that in 2 weeks," right? Like, it's a system that nobody's caring about anymore, right? And those systems still need to stay up to date, right? They have to be in our plan, right? And so I think it's very easy, especially when systems become very large and very complex, to say, "Look, I'm going to patch everything above a 7." I don't even know what that means, right? I don't know what scale I'm using, or whatever. But if it's above a 7, then patch it, right? Like, because we have to start somewhere, right? And so, Josh, I see you. I like jump in there. Like, how do you feel
So
about
I
that?
have a different view on this, actually. I come from an AppSec world. I shed my yoke of operations years ago. And so I think it's kind of a different story, I think, a lot of times. Like, if you're an application person and you run, let's say, NPM update just across your whole project, it will
Hmm.
explode, like
Yeah,
100%
for sure.
guaranteed. And I
Well,
think
you'll have some things to fix, right?
that's the
Yeah.
polite way of
Well,
saying it. Yes.
yeah, I think it's because you forgot the dash dash
Right.
force,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
That's right.
right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
I
and
caught
Uh-huh.
but I caught flack for that, Josh, suggesting that people should do that, right? Because I when I was developing software, and again, I was only working with 10 to 15,000 lines of Python in its that's a small application, right? And I had one of them. I didn't
sure.
have 100 or 1,000 like a lot of enterprises do. I was like, look, I'm going to, every time I do the build and development, I'm going to update all of my packages, right? I'm going to update the container environment. I'm going to update all of my Python packages. And if something breaks, I'm going to take the time to fix it on a smaller scale. So
Yeah.
I'm going to like retract what I said before based on feedback, because people got really upset. And like, I get it. On a smaller scale, that works. On a larger scale, to kind of go where you're going, Josh, like that could be really bad and
Yeah.
cause more disruptions than perhaps a security event, quite frankly, right? So
Right.
that's the
Right.
risk-based decisions that we have to make.
I mean, like CrowdStrike taught us availability is a pretty
It's
big deal.
huge.
Like,
Yeah.
but now at the same time, I think there is a discussion to be had in this space, which is not the discussion we're going to have today. But for example, like there's GitHub has Dependabot, where Dependabot will try to automatically upgrade your dependencies and then run the unit tests. And if the unit tests fail, it's like, don't do this. It's a bad idea. And if the unit tests pass, then it says, if you would like
I
to, you
love
may
that.
merge this. And like,
I
that's
love
a
that.
really good first step, right?
Yeah. Because it's down with like what I say, where if it's easy and low operational risk, apply it.
for
If
sure.
those two conditions are true, apply it, regardless of the CVSS score, regardless of the however else you want to measure severity. If it's low operational risk and it's easy to do, then do it, right? You're reducing your attack surface.
For sure. Yep.
Well, I'm curious, anybody's take in the last year or two, is it your take that individual operations or they are not automating more of the patching and scoring in some way in their organization than they were 2 or 3 years ago?
I think they are.
So I think when we start talking about endpoints specifically, like the employee systems, I think that generally speaking, we've reached a point where, look, you know, get, say whatever you want, but Microsoft is doing a great job with patches, right? Like, and like they're rolling out patches to however many systems every month, and I feel like those have become pretty automated, right? Like, and even
Until they get
servers
to dual
some
boot
point.
Linux and Windows systems, which we'll talk about in the next segment. But yeah.
Whoops.
But
Oops.
I think the bigger problem is what Josh just mentioned, right? When you have a very large application that's using that has that imports other code that has been found to be catastrophic, it's very, very difficult to do, Paul, what you just said, where hey, every time I release, I upgrade my build environment, I do all these things, right? And so Paul, like the stuff that I write is more like what you did, very small,
Right.
just for me, and even I've run into that npm update force and
Right.
everything wrecked. And like,
Well, I see it on my I see it on my
God, I don't know
personal
what to do.
systems too. Like I run a rolling release, right? I run Manjaro, which is like I'm not quite brave enough to go down the full Arch path, right? So I go with Manjaro because it's a step down and it's not Ubuntu, right? Fedora is
Yeah.
probably a great option. I think they're pretty close in terms of updating, comparatively speaking, to Manjaro.
Somebody should put that on a shirt, because only these people here even know what the fuck you're talking
Right?
about. Like,
Right?
yeah, I run Manjaro. I'm not brave enough for Arch, but it's not Ubuntu. What?
I love
You're
it.
totally right. If you're not like in the know in that of that terminology, you're like speaking gibberish. Completely agree.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, it's not all roses and rainbows, right? Like I run into issues. And when I run into issues, then I learn how to sometimes get ahead of those issues. But no matter what I do, it costs me time. And time is money when we're developing applications and we're not pushing out a release. Instead, we're troubleshooting, dependencies and other updates to packages and libraries rather than fixing bugs and implementing new features. And I totally get it. So that's why, like, the scale, like I can sit here on my pulpit and say, like, I have 3 Manjaro Linux systems and I update them all the time. Well, that's great. And it still costs me time. And I do try and get ahead, which I think is the lesson there, right? Because I do want to patch often and frequently. But now when I see a big update come through where there's a stable announcement for Manjaro, I click, no, I don't want to do that right now. I go to the forum post, I read and there's a voting system. How many people have applied this update and had a good experience or a bad experience, right? So I look at that. And then I look at the reported problems. People have already applied the update. Is there something I can do that makes this update go more smoothly, right? So I think the part of the answer, having said all that, and it's flying off the top of my head, flying off the cuff, is that improving your processes can help improve your rate at which you can apply patches, right? Having a really good IT management process is huge here. And I don't want to poo-poo people who, don't apply everything all at once, because this shit is hard. This is not easy, right? A lot of times when I read something, I'm like, wait, you're saying I need to do what? Like, I got to research that first. Like, this is not like easy stuff. It's hard. But we can continually get better. And I think we have to make strides to get better at applying patches and putting in remediation as soon as we can, and not wait and not start thinking about, well, is it on the Kev? Where in Mitre Att&ck does it fall? Like, what does EPSS say is going to be this? Like, how do we get to just patching the stuff? Jeff, you have a comment?
I've got two questions for the older members of the group, which is none of you, I guess. But in the early days of the World Wide Web internet security, it was conventional wisdom and recommendations to not be on the latest release of anything. You always wanted to be one or two revs behind. So my first question is, when did we switch gears and decide everything's got to be the latest, and why did we listen to the scan vendors? My second question was to you, Paul. Again, why make the decision to patch? I guess in all the gibberish you were throwing out there, which one do you update first? Which platform? That's not my real question. My other real question was, do we still, again, in the old days, there was a test lab, there was a dev environment where you test all the patches before you pushed it out to production. Is that part of the automation these days, in theory? I mean, that's part of the problem with what happened with CrowdStrike, is seemingly somewhere something, either QA or testing wasn't done, or not enough testing was done.
You threw out a ton of things, but I can answer your number one directly. So
wait, what was number one? I forgot. There was too many questions in there. I'm lost now.
Right.
When did we shift gears from never run the latest release to we've got to push
I like that.
out
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that for a hot minute.
When that happened, Jeff, it's when it wasn't about new features being added. It was about fixing the security problems that were discovered. Right. So there was certainly a shift in computing at some point where so every time a vulnerability is discovered, right, we go up a notch. We understand that vulnerability a little bit more, and we go look at other apps or similar problems. Look at like serialization of data. Like when that came out, like everybody was kind of like, what? And then all of a sudden it just became this huge, big issue, right? And that's when that switch, not necessarily when that vulnerability came out, but when you take a look at the latest releases, right, of your software, whatever software we're talking about, an app, whatever, it doesn't matter. Are we talking about adding features? Are we talking about fixing problems, right? And so back in the day, what it was is we were adding features, right? Like, and hey, look at all the cool shit that I can do. And then all of a sudden we got better and better and better at finding problems. And then it became, look, man, if you're not running on the latest bleeding edge code, you're subject to these 7 vulnerabilities.
Bill, I'm just gonna build on what you said. I have a slightly different take on it. I think that in the past 20 plus years or so, we've gotten better at producing more reliable software. Now, a lot of people are going to be like, well, that's not true. Software still sucks. And yes, I agree.
That's true.
But it sucks a lot less than it did back in the day. Like, you ever look at like an old picture of like your old PC that ran like Windows 95 or Windows 98? Like, how much time do we spend troubleshooting like ridiculously complex issues and just like shit didn't work?
Yeah.
And but today when we develop software, I think we've learned in the past 20 years how to develop more reliable software. And this can go to operational and or security issues, right? It's much better today, which is why, Jeff, to your point, I'm like, we need to be changing our mindset that I don't need to run Red Hat or Windows XP to be reliable. I can run the latest stuff and be just as reliable because we're better at creating more reliable software.
So you're absolutely correct, but we're also we also add the variable of complexity in today's software.
No, agreed.
And that complexity adds this attack surface that is completely different than what we had in code in the past, right? So when you talk about like, and I'm not gonna sit here and say that Windows 3.1.1 is better or more, less vulnerable than the newest operating. I don't have any idea. But what I know is, back when we were writing software, then we were writing a very specific task. It did this thing. It was a calculator.
Yep.
right? You know what I mean? And now think about what an app does. Who knows? It's every app is makes 1,000 API calls, exposes its a
Right.
thousand of its own
It does
APIs.
Bluetooth, it does Wi-Fi, it does
Right,
NFC, it has access to my
right.
microphone, my camera, it does all the things.
Hmm.
Yeah. Complexity definitely hurts us when it comes to being up to date. But Jeff, that I think that answers your question as to why, like, there was a time when I was really afraid to go to the next version, and I'm not as afraid today.
Yeah, but that's very fair what Bill said. I mean, we did shift from features to bug fixes and vulnerability fixes. That makes a whole lot of sense.
What's
The
so
second question is, doesn't anybody do testing and dev before pushing into production anymore?
Well, but I think that's back to Bill's point of complexity. Our software is so complex today that it's hard to have accurate. Like, the more complex your software is, the more complex your tests need to be. And I don't think we're keeping pace with our tests. Like, I think unit testing is amazing. And unit testing
yeah.
used to be a manual thing. I was the developer, I was running code, and then I ran my code and I made sure it worked to what I thought it was going to run. Now unit testing is totally automatable, but only as automated as the people writing the tests, right? I think QA people have made this transition from being QA software tester people to developers who write code to actually test software. But it's keeping pace with all the complexity is still hard.
But isn't that part of the automation problem though? Because, like, again, not to pick on CrowdStrike and or Microsoft, but it seems like we would have expected to CrowdStrike to do the QA and testing before they pushed it out. But when it seems like there's a shift then, and we're trusting the vendors to do the testing and push out stuff that works. And to Bill's point about the complexity, you know, it's anybody's ball game. So when did the shift occur where we're trusting the vendors to do the testing rather than, okay, they're pushing out this patch, let's stop it here, test it before we let it roll into production. But that sort of flies in the face of the automation we were talking about earlier as being the desired goal.
I completely agree. I think it stopped when I think us trusting the vendors started when we started paying, $35 an endpoint or whatever CrowdStrike costs, right? You just expect that I'm getting, and again, I'm not picking on CrowdStrike either, but you just expect that those things are happening. And Jeff, you're absolutely correct. We blindly trusted, right? And I think that we as a community got caught, right? Because when we look at the question that's being presented to us, how do you prioritize patching, right? Is there an answer? Like, I don't even know. I don't know if there is an answer. It truly is now, and this has actually hit us a couple times, just over the last year, where being on the latest release, Jeff, just like what you're saying, being on the latest release bit you in the ass, right? Like, there's been a few times where, like, hey, I didn't get hacked because I wasn't running the latest, right? Like that, like it's a tough problem. It truly is a risk based decision.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm recommending, right, as we look at Mitre Att&ck, we look at CVSS, we look at CVSS, and we look at EPSS. Those are four completely different things, right? And in and of I guess my point with the whole thing, we come down to the crux of it, is those are four, like, okay things on their own, but if you were to combine those together to make an informed decision, that to me is where we need to be, right?
Well, and doesn't that also fall on the organization then more to put that together and create some kind of
Correct.
automation on their own? Because they've got to
Right.
put in, just like you were talking about, put in their own organizational differentiation on what matters.
What do we compensating controls, right? None of those frameworks are going to.
That's almost as euphemistic as saying a risk-based decision, because I mean, we hear that all the time in the PCI world. But okay, most of the time my clients, when they say they're making a risk-based decision, they're kind of like,
yeah,
hope nothing goes wrong.
I hope nothing bad happens is not a risk-based decision.
I mean, hope is a strategy. It's just not a good one.
So my ask would be, what are some 2 or 3 or 4 things to consider when making a risk-based decision?
Hmm. So I would think that, and we've already kind of talked about them already, but criticality to the business has to
Mm-hmm.
be number one, right? Like that's one number one. And then I also, Josh, I don't know if you were the one that said it or who said it, but um, nearness to the internet or however it was phrased, I was like, that was brilliant, right? But like, so
That
is
was
this
me.
thing? All right, Jeff, it was
Josh said
brilliant, right?
availability is something we need
Yeah,
to focus on, and I said
for
proximity to the internet.
proximity to internet is brilliant because often what people say is this thing internet accessible,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's not exactly right. Proximity to the internet is much more correct. And then but so those would be, and then in my opinion the third one would be relative ease of what of exploiting the vulnerability as it exists, right? And that may not be correct. I'd actually welcome someone beating me up
Yeah, I'll
about
beat you
those
up on
three.
that a bit. I think that ease of exploitability, you can throw that out the window because as soon as someone figures out the complexity, they're just going to sell it on the black market.
That part will get
So,
automated.
yeah, like a lot of
Yeah.
the some of the vulnerabilities that I look at, I'm like, wow, that like truly is complex. And complex is like it's like a weird term, right? Like we just use it to say something that I don't understand. That doesn't mean someone else doesn't understand it really well because they spent the past 10 years working in that space. They have enough knowledge to go create a kit that they can go sell on the black market. And then the other threat actors are like, I need to accomplish a goal. Like we've literally seen this in the news this week. I need to accomplish a goal. I need to bypass EDR and disable or get around Windows protections. Oh, I can just go buy this thing. I don't have to understand how it works. I can just go buy this thing and it helps me accomplish my goal. It only takes one threat actor or malicious actor to make something available before it becomes a commodity.
But that's the job of EPSS, Paul, is to give me some information that says the likelihood of this thing being exploited is this. And it's one of the so it's funny. I've listened to you all talk around all of these things that are happening, all of this information that we have or should have.
Mm.
And this is something we're starting to see in actually the source composition analysis universe now, is where these systems are starting to take in a bunch of information and look at, like, what is the EPSS score? What is the CVSS score? What is the reachability of this exploit? Like, what is the purpose of this system? Is this system in a high profile place in the organization, or is this like, some Python script that runs once a month to download a stock quote or something? And I think what we're finding is it's not until you combine everything together that you start getting something that's kind of useful. Because if you pick any one of these things by themselves, it is basically useless. But when we start to bring them together, now we have a story to tell.
Right. EPSS is interesting. And I think, like, and again, in all of these
And
cases,
just for giggles, expand the acronym.
EPSS is the exploit predictability scoring system.
Thank you. I knew
Um,
that. I just didn't remember.
yeah. And so like Wade and Jay are doing awesome work. Everyone like Adam at Mitre is doing amazing work. Todd at CISA is doing amazing work. I don't want to take away from what they're doing. Again, I think I agree with Josh said, like individually, like you're going to do yourself a disservice if it's just one. EPSS is interesting because I think we do have enough data to look at vulnerabilities, and then when a new one comes out, go the likelihood and probability that this will be exploited is this, right? I think some of the challenges that Wade and Jay have is getting enough of that data, right? Like they can't get enough data. And as they get more data and better data, EPSS will continue to improve. I think one of my kind of nitpicky things I have with EPSS, I expressed this when I interviewed Wade and Jay on the Below the Surface podcast, was sometimes I look at your score and I think it's really low because I see attackers exploiting that, right? So I think it's really low. And their answer is basically we're working on getting better data, improving our models to make it better. But that's a great answer, by the way, because no one creates something perfect in the first run. Like it's gonna, especially when we talk about machine learning, things are gonna get better over time, especially as you improve your sources. So I think that's a good endorsement for EPSS, but take it with a grain of salt too.
Well, it's another data point. I think there's 2 more factors to consider. Well, probably more than that. Two that I come to mind. One is the consequence. We've sort of alluded to that.
The impact. Are you talking about like the impact?
Well,
What's
consequence.
the difference between
Consequence is
consequence
my
and
old infosec term.
yeah?
Call it impact, but I mean, I always argue that there's, and this ties back to a risk equation. Companies are looking at two risks, at least in the private sector: loss of revenue and the cost of doing business, or the cost of whatever the fix is, which is my second aspect, is the cost. Part of the risk factor, the risk based decision has to be, you know, and this is where it gets really insoluble, I think, is, if something bad happens, we go out of business. The cost of, calculate the cost of that. And what's it going to cost to make the fix? What's the potential cost if the fix doesn't work and takes things offline? And underlying all this is, and this is all works together, and it's all in PCI, by the way, understanding an inventory of all your assets and systems, know what it is that you have that's valuable and sensitive. And that's not just data these days, it's operations, and having some idea of the flow. It's not just a proximity to the internet, but it's also proximity to the core of the business. I mean, in the old days, when everybody had, the corporate network, but production was isolated and was over there and was internet reachable, it was maybe a little bit easier to grasp. But I was thinking about this just yesterday. I mean, the network basically doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it does traditionally, but in a larger sense, most of internet security was grew up about the idea of network security. And it's, we've talked about this on countless episodes with countless buzzwords.
Spaff last week was talking about that, right? And I
I
don't know if he said it on,
a little bit.
and I think he expanded upon it actually off air when I was speaking with him. Is he was like, when he first started in, computer science in school, he's like, I would take a microcontroller. He's like, I could tell you everything about that. I could tell you how the hardware works, the software. I knew everything, like soup to nuts. He's like, you can't take even like the smallest application now and even really do that and understand every single dependency and every single line of code that makes up even your smallest application. Even if you download a small Python utility and it has 3 or 4 requirements, you don't know what every single line of code is doing in all those requirements, right? So I think that's a huge shift in our understanding of like what we have, to your point, Jeff.
Well, again, in the early days, my even of PCI, my customers would say, well, we don't want to be, this is in the old days when there was newspapers, we don't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times being the next company that's been breached. Let's say we don't want to be the next Krebs article or something like that, or whatever our buzz feeds are today. But I'm like, okay, great. You have some idea of, you don't want that to happen. Now here's all the things that you should be doing to fix it. And they all have a cost. And how much do you want to spend? And nobody can afford, in my opinion, to do everything, which is why we've, as an industry, become fixated. Well, at least we can fix vulnerabilities and do patching, right? We'll get that part right. Let's fix all the vulnerabilities, because that's the one variable in the risk equation that we seem to be able to do something about.
Hope is free, Jeff.
I want to harp on.
No, it's not,
point.
because it's largely tied to liquor.
So I had this like pretty neat insight, I think, when I spoke with the Mitre Att&ck folks, the CVSS folks, and the EPSS folks, and in varying degrees, all those different frameworks are based on an attack observed in the wild.
Right.
And one metric that I'm very curious to get your thoughts on is, like, I think there's a big difference between a vulnerability that was exploited once in the wild and we observed it, therefore we check the box, exploited in the wild, and a vulnerability that was exploited thousands of times in the wild. I think that factors into our likelihood or probability, I don't know which, in our risk equation, right? Like, just because an attacker exploited it once doesn't mean it's as widespread. Is that something we need to take into consideration? Bill's like, no, you're wrong.
Well, so I mean,
which is
like,
fine.
I understand your point, but the point you could also make, and it's almost exactly what you're saying is it in Metasploit? Yes or no? Right? Like, and that's not
the
the
accessibility
decision.
of the I
right?
mean,
Like, that's the same argument, and that's not the right argument to
no.
make, right?
Because
So,
we don't know. I mean,
uh,
how do you know how many people have the exploit and or are using it? I mean, just because maybe we caught it once and that organization
mhm,
was really good at catching that one particular exploit. The rest of the
mhm.
organizations that we're monitoring for that aren't great at catching that exploit. Maybe they fell victim to it, but just didn't detect it. How many times you read a report that's like, yeah, the attackers got in and they did this, but the initial compromise, we don't know how they got in. So
Yeah,
what are we measuring
I
exactly, right?
I've had to write that report before, and I hated it.
Yeah, I mean,
Like, that's the
you do
worst.
instant
That is
response, right? Sometimes
that is the
you
worst.
don't get the
I don't
answer.
know.
Well, how did they
Yeah.
initially get in? I don't know. I can see what they did once they
Mhm,
got in, but I don't know how
mhm.
the initial thing was. So we're missing a huge chunk of data, I feel like.
I know one thing we can rule out definitively: who would ever attack us? Who would ever do this to us?
Yeah.
So true,
Listen,
right?
that's funny. Yeah. Yeah. I think, like, so I think the answer to the question is, if you're not developing your own applications, right? If you truly are a consumer of apps,
Yeah, I think,
uh,
but Bill, I want to stop you there because
every
I think that's a big differentiator and one that I make when I present the supply chain
Yeah.
is right. Like
Mhm,
you got hardware, you got your pre-OS, you got your OS and drivers, and you've got applications that you get from everywhere else, like Zoom and Chrome and all those things, right?
mhm.
And then the final bucket in supply chain for me is you're developing your own applications, right? And they have libraries and dependencies. Those are like 4 or 5 completely different landscapes to
Com-
secure.
Absolutely. Right, but I like, so if you're a company though that is not developing your own apps, like, I think that it is negligence if I find a vulnerability that's a year old in that environment, right? Like,
Mm.
that to me is, this is purely negligence, that somebody didn't care,
Yeah, dude, if you're
right?
running a browser that hasn't been updated in a year, good lord, like
Right,
shame on you today. I mean, and we still see Internet Explorer out there, which is crazy, right?
for sure,
But again,
for sure.
I think we've come a long way from the early days of browsers, right? Like again, 20 years ago in software, if I was updating my browser, that might all of a sudden like web pages aren't loading and I'm experiencing crashes and things like that. Like how many times in the past 5 years have you updated Chrome or Firefox or any of the major browsers and it had like completely heinous issues? Like it's
Yeah, see,
pretty,
and
to me, it's pretty seamless. And I'm very skeptical when I say
Yeah,
that, but I have
that's
to say like it's
usually
pretty seamless, right?
365,
Yeah.
not the browser where there's heinous
so
issues with
so
Right.
so
Right.
most
But I
a
mean, like how
most
many times we
transparent
updated our
update.
in past 5 years, you update Chrome, and how many times you going, oh, that update makes it so like I can't get to my banking website or something like that.
yeah,
Like it's very infrequent today.
Hey, you brought up
that,
Internet Explorer. Raise your hand if you remember the days where you could uninstall Internet Explorer.
Oh yeah, Microsoft doesn't let you do that.
Nope.
That's one of my most famous social
but
media
see,
posts was the meme about, like, hey Windows, I need you to uninstall Edge, and Windows is like, no, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And then you go to Linux,
mm.
hey, I want to uninstall my bootloader, and it's like, yeah, go for it, sure,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, go.
I don't care.
Good luck, everybody. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, and so, like, the browsers are certainly one thing,
Hmm.
because, honestly, like, if we start looking at and using the word negligence when we're talking about the end user on an end device, are you kidding me? That browser has, like, go ahead, run bleeding edge, like,
Right,
patch
right.
everything. But so, like, but a lot of the cases that I've worked this year, and in fact, a lot of the stories that we cover month, or week after week after month, are like VPN systems that have have an RCE, and and who is out there, like, going out and just checking to see if my firewall needs a new firmware, or my VPN concentrator needs a new patch, or
Well,
whatever.
that's
That to
yeah.
me is
That's the hard part. How do you know when that stuff needs an update? Because our visibility into those systems is low. The
yeah, you got to
attackers
check.
are going after them, but the operational risk. This is the kind of like crux of the issue there. The operational risk to updating your VPN or firewall is really high. I remember
For sure.
reading a year or so ago because we have this coverage like at Eclipsium, so I follow this very closely. But there was I forget the vendor, but if you updated the VPN concentrator, you had to like basically reboot it, right? And then there was another case where if you wanted to pull like you'll appreciate this, Bill, you want to pull the forensics data from a VPN appliance. Well, that means it has to be down for 20 minutes. look, okay, hold on. I'm pulling down the VPN concentrators for my entire company, and so I can pull forensics data. And like, so who's doing that, right? Like, again, the operational risk is way too high.
The last case that I worked, the very last case that I worked, you could not get firewall logs unless you took the like
Yes,
you could look through the logs on the box, but if you wanted them like off of
yeah, you
it,
got like, yeah, it has to go into like some mode where it
it was
processes. Yeah, isn't it? I
yeah.
forget the vendor. I won't pick on the vendor,
I'm
dude,
not going to
because
beat
like
them up
writing
yet.
software is hard. Okay, like this is why, like, don't knock me because I don't pick on vendors. Like, I'm not picking on vendors. One, I work for a vendor, right? A lot of us work for a vendor, right? But like, writing software is hard. So and then, like, I get it, but and hopefully they
But
get better. But
this begs a question, in terms of prioritization, the types of patches, the types of vulnerabilities, whether it's hardware, firmware, OS, networking equipment versus servers, applications, and how many different types of applications are there? Is there an implied order of criticality just based on the nature of what's vulnerable?
no, it varies, man. I mean, firmware is just software that's inconvenient to program. It's one of the greatest quotes I've ever read on the internet, and it came from a comment in an Ars Technica article, right?
Nice.
But
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 again,
I
it
think
doesn't.
you're saying it does. I mean, just based on the last couple minutes of conversation,
But it's so dependent on your environment, right? Like, there are some firmware updates where I could tell you, like, probably going to be totally fine, right? But there are some firmware updates that you're going to update secure boot and it's not it could not be fine, and depends on a lot of things. There are a lot of
and how do you
application,
tell the difference between those two?
and that's why we all have jobs. I mean, that's why a lot of security analysts have jobs, because it's so dependent on multiple factors right now that you have to really research. Like, what am I updating
The
that is going to have impact on operational risk?
the interesting thing to your question, Jeff, is the answer is like it's counterintuitive to the criticality of the asset to the organization, right? Like so when we like and when I think about like what systems do I like, who cares full send? Like just click the automate button and go. Like what are those systems like? The employee computers go,
Yeah,
right?
right. Like
Yeah, like
CrowdStrike, like just let it automatically deploy an update; it'll be fine.
for sure.
But I think,
Like
that's really, it's really rare, right? I want to call out the CrowdStrike event as something like, it's super rare. There's a number of things that have to go wrong across the board, from CrowdStrike, from Microsoft. Just like
yeah.
Spaff said last week, look, it's CrowdStrike, it's Microsoft, and it's everyone who manages computers for every enterprise on the planet. We all had to make mistakes that led to that. So I think, to me, that's kind of like a,
They're rare, but the complexity that we're talking about implies that the rare events are going to become more frequent, kind of like the 100-year floods that are happening every 10
yeah,
years.
yeah.
Like there's that book, The Black Swan, right? Like so but yeah, it's such an interesting question. So, are we going to give the listeners an answer of how to, how do you prioritize patching vulnerabilities? And the answer is, man, I don't know.
It
Good luck,
depends.
everybody. Yeah.
Well, it's really funny you say that. So, I wrote an article. I actually don't know where we're going to publish it yet. So, like, I wrote it, and my coworkers and I, they read it, and we're like, okay, we should publish this somewhere. So I don't know where to send you yet to read it. But when I was writing the article, I would like take breaks and go like watch my kid. Like, a lot of us work from home. I'm like, there was a magic 8 ball just like sitting on the table in the living room,
Mm.
and like I picked it up and it said very likely.
Patch. It's
And I
a
was like, yeah,
patch.
I was like, wait, this ties in so closely. Like, we could literally like follow these frameworks, or we could patch based on a magic 8 ball, and we'd probably come up with like the same result, right?
That
Was
is an
kind of
epic
my
swag
takeaway.
idea, like a
Yep.
patching eight
So
ball.
what's funny is
Oh my God,
Patching
that's
8 ball.
so funny.
my boss Ariella, who's amazing at marketing, actually said that. She's like, used to work for a company, and they had a giveaway. There was a magic 8 ball that had industry specific things that it suggested. Exactly that. Yep.
Nice.
Doesn't mean we can't do it again.
Right. So yeah,
Pat.
like, so my point, like, are you better off with a magic 8 ball? Are you better off following the standards? I think the answer is, you've got to come up with your own strategy in
It
scoring
depends how
system
much
for
the
yourself.
Magic 8 Ball costs,
Mm.
because I may have to factor that in.
You may just find one like I did the other day. I'm like,
Or
where did this come from?
we used to carry around what was it called, coins, and you could flip a coin, heads or
Mm-hmm.
tails. Patch, don't patch. You're probably still just as good.
That'd be a great like coin to make as a giveaway.
There we go.
Yeah, and like weight the don't patch just a little bit hard,
Yeah, right,
heavier, so
right,
it mostly lands on patch. Yeah.
right.
I'm curious because, okay, through the conversation, haven't really heard anything that's specific to the increase in mobile devices being where a lot of work is done and where there's so many personal and work related applications on the mobile device. So, with that being the trend of the world, and with everyone here, with your experience, do you see that that is changing how things are prioritized or about how the actual vulnerabilities are discussed?
No, because people still don't want to update their phones. Like, go, like, do this as a social experiment after you hear this episode. Go, if you work in security, go to your friends and family and say, hey, like, is your phone updated? Like, if you let me have your phone, which like none of us would do for each other. Like, I would never give Bill my phone and Bill would never give me his phone, right? But with your
It's
other
true.
friends
It's
and
true.
family,
Yeah.
be like,
Yeah.
hey, give me your
With the
phone
yeah, yeah.
and check to see if they've updated. I guarantee you, like, if we all put a vote on whatever, Twitter or whatever, we would say that most people's phones are not up to date, right? Because it's not something they think about. It's not something they want to do. They don't want to stop using their phone to apply the update. They don't recognize the risk. Now, we tell them collectively as security practitioners, like, there's like this thing came out, like, you really need to update your phone, right? And we likely update our devices at a crazy, insane level. Like, I'm like kind of paranoid
Me
about
too.
updating my phone, right? Always making sure it's the latest, Android release. And even at that, I'm still like, what telemetry can I have that my phone isn't? My watch is freaking out lately. I think it's because I got it wet. Um, I think that's why, but
Ayo.
it's my watch is in like a bad situation. I have a Google Watch, and a Pixel Watch, and it's really frustrating. But anyway,
Yeah, but
I stay up to date.
what's the risk of your Google Watch going south,
Well,
or
the watch just
somebody
runs.
using it?
Yeah, I would be impressed if you were to hack me, and you were to do it from my watch. Like, I would be impressed. I would be impressed.
This sounds like a
Fun.
So
challenge.
so going back to Mandy's question, I think that that the especially in an enterprise, in an enterprise, that specific attack vector is heavily understood, right? And one of the things that we look to do is using tools like whatever the various MDM is, being able to containerize work data away from personal data, and then also keep the applications that we use. So whatever those are, like the the email platform, the VPN, whatever those are, but then we manage the patching of those in that container on those phones, right? And so and with that MDM, what I really worry about, as a security person is, how are people using their the personal side of that phone? Is it jailbroken, right? Those kind of things. But at least I know that in the event that that phone were to be lost, stolen, TikToked, whatever,
Compromised in some way,
like,
you can wipe
yeah,
it remotely, but that can be
I
used
can wipe
against
it
you too. We covered a story
for
where
sure.
I think it was in
For sure.
Singapore, right? In Singapore, they got into the MDM software and they wiped a whole bunch of devices.
Well, that's a risk that I'd be willing to
That's a
take, right?
different
So I
topic.
mean,
Discussion is security tools that get turned against us,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
CrowdStrike was the incident that we were like, it's interesting. There's actually been some published research about people, doing that. But again, I think that's a different topic from trying to figure out what you need to patch.
Well, me too. And I think that every time that we see one of those security tools used against us is all it's do is improving the response to building backdoors into crypto and those kind of things. Because, like, look, we can prove, right? Like, we can prove that if there's a backdoor in crypto, it's going to be found.
Mhm.
I mean, like, and I'm looking to see if Jeff's
Are
smiling
you
because
saying,
I want.
Mr. Potato Head? You're saying Mr. Potato Head backdoors are not secrets, is what you're saying.
That's right. Yeah.
So I want to go back, Josh, and I think I'm going to tee up nicely here. I want to go back to the CISA-KEV and CVSS that share this one thing in common, that a CVE entry has to exist
Yes.
in order to score it with CVSS.
Yep.
And what Todd Beardsley, who's a dear friend of mine, and he's awesome, and articulates very nicely. He leads the one of the leads on the CISA-KEV project. He's like, look, I'm like, what do I need to do to qualify to be on the KEV? He's like, you got to have a CVE, you got to be observable as being exploited in the wild, and you also have to have a patch. But he caveated, like, there was an asterisk to that if the patch isn't available, but there's a vulnerability and the vendor has end of lifed it, they will put it on the KEV and say you got to remove that from your network. So that's just kind of like the asterisk there. But for the most part, CVSS and KEV, it's got to be a CVE, right? But all of us know, like, not everything gets a CVE.
That's right. I mean, I think a lot of things do. The stuff that matters does. And there's potentially millions of vulnerabilities just hanging out in open source. I mean, to kind of set this up, there's a data set I work with.
They just haven't been discovered yet.
Well, right.
We all know they're there.
For
you
sure.
could say that for commercial software too.
I mean, I don't know, Jeff, if everyone does. I don't think it's well understood how big of a problem this could be. Like, there are over 9 million open source projects in use from the packaging ecosystem.
This is just projects.
Right. And like, this is like NPM install, PyPy install, pip install, stuff like that, right? Not over 9 million. Now, granted, I bet you 80% of that is like weird crap some random person uploaded that's only ever used by them and maybe a friend or something. So it's not like the risk is enormous. However, even if you kind of break that down, 10% of 9 million is still like a million. And we all know if you look at any piece of software, you can find vulnerabilities in it without trying very hard. So even if we think a million packages that matter, and if each one of those only has one vulnerability, which is a ridiculous number because it's probably tens or hundreds, we're at a million. There have been 250,000 CVEs ever published at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So, like, when you think about it, it's kind of a crazy problem. Now, however, to date, every important thing that actually matters has gotten a CVE. I can't think of a single instance of a security vulnerability that didn't get a CVE. Maybe not right away. I can't even think of one that didn't have one before it became an issue, to be honest.
Ones that have a major impact.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm hearing you say, and I think it's important to distinguish, vulnerabilities by definition are not a risk.
That's right.
In and of themselves.
That's right. Yeah.
Risk is something else. Vulnerability is just a piece of it.
Yeah.
Which is why we need to keep harping on these other factors.
Yeah.
Variables. Things like the likelihood of exploitation. Is it available in the wild? Has it been bundled up and is freely available?
That's why every vulnerability write-up says could allow an attacker to do X, Y, Z. Right? It's the presence of basically an open door,
which begs it's not just the vulnerability in and of itself with some score, and the scores like the CVSS scores attempt to take some of those other things into account, but they're still very often hypothetical, it's hard to measure. But the things that are more tangible is known exploit in the wild that's been, mass produced or is
along
out there
those
for
lines.
Everybody.
One question, and Josh specifically, I want to get, because we haven't talked about this, because you've been on the show a couple of times talking about this topic, right? Yeah. When we talk about chaining vulnerabilities, that, to Jeff's point, the risk to my organization for one given vulnerability is one thing, but how do I calculate the risk for chaining vulnerabilities together? Now, this can take several different shapes and forms. This could be within the same software application. This could be multiple software applications where I'm chaining vulnerabilities. How do we have commercial and or open source tools that allow us to determine the risk based on multiple vulnerabilities?
Not yet. I mean, look, we don't have that ability yet. I think it will come eventually. I mean, I think to kind of tie off of what Jeff was saying with all the vulnerabilities, all this data, and it's not risk, is one of the things we need to do as an industry. And I think we're starting to do this at least in the AppSec universe. I don't pay as close of attention to like the operations InfoSec space, but in the AppSec world, there's, I think, is an understanding is beginning to emerge where we realize like just CVSS score is meaningless. Like just CVEID is meaningless. These are becoming data science problems where we have to start taking these larger picture views of things. And because today there's this obsession with like no CVEs. We have to patch all our CVEs in our application. And the reality is no one can do that. So you just end up with a mess. And it can be like the Cobra effect, right? Where if you say, if you bring me a dead cobra, I'll give you, $1. Well, people start breeding cobras and making a ton of friggin' money. And so I think the industry is starting to put these pieces together. And I think EPSS is the thing that gives me the most hope, is kind of driving it, because the EPSS folks are really clear about this. Like, we are not we're not the only metric you need to use. We are a part of a larger thing.
Jay said that to me. Yep, absolutely.
For sure. And so 100%. I think they're what's really making people think about this. But I think what you're talking about, like exploit chaining, for example, I hope we get there someday. It's a long ways away. Because I mean, like just today, if we knew, like if everything had EPSS score and everything had, let's say, a variant of CVSS, maybe CVSS, maybe not, whatever. And then we also knew, like, is the code reachable? How am I using this application? Like, how is it deployed in my infrastructure? Like, what kind of data is on the other side of this application? And so we can start putting all of this information together. And now we can start talking about the actual risk of a particular vulnerability. And then I think it can get really interesting.
Yeah, we're up on time, so I'll turn it to Jeff for closing thoughts.
Quick point. I agree and disagree with you, Josh. We do have it today. It's what the pen test is supposed to do. The pen test is supposed to be the people chaining the vulnerabilities together. But it's been commoditized to just another form of vulnerability discovery.
Pretty much.
More times than not.
Yep.
Right. The efficacy of the pen test will be discussed in a future topic. I want to thank Josh Bressers for coming in last minute, helping us with this segment.
It was
Josh,
fun.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Josh.
With that, we will take a short break and come back with the security news. Stay tuned.